Hello, everyone. Today we're looking at the religious settlement of 1559. This was Elizabeth's big plan on how she was going to sort out the problem of religion in her country. Before we do get started, let's just have a quick refresh on the major differences between being a Protestant and being a Puritan. So remember, Protestants were Catholics who actually left the Catholic Church to start their own religion because they didn't think that being Catholic was good enough. So we have the first religious reformation. So we have Catholics, some deciding to remain as Catholics and some deciding to become Protestants. Now we're going to have a second religious reformation from Protestants. So some of those people are going to decide, I'm going to remain as a Protestant, or being Protestant isn't quite good enough, I'm going to change a little bit and become a Puritan. So we have to remember that Puritans were Protestants who actually left the Protestant church because they didn't feel it was strict enough. So we need to think of Puritans as being even more religiously pure, and that's where we get the word Puritan from, than Protestants were. Essentially, they all come from the same place. They all come from the Christian church, but we can see there's divisions within the different sects of these faiths. Catholics, remember, they liked having loads of decorations in the church, lots of gold. Protestants said, decorations are nice to have, but we don't need them. It's more about going to church for the religious element and less for the show-off factor, if you will. And Puritans said, we don't need any kind of decorations. Church is about faith, and that's it. So we've got four key terms to look at. We have regent, excommunicate, Marian exiles, and vestments. Now, a regent is a person who oversees the throne when a monarch is underage. And underage was considered to be too young to make decisions for themselves. Now, sometimes kings and queens could be a few days old if they were born and their parents had died, whether it was disease or war or even in childbirth. A regent would step in and kind of oversee the running of the kingdom until that monarch was old enough. Now, even though a monarch might take control at the age of 12 or 13 or 14, they weren't ruling alone, and they would have a group of advisors who would help them to make decisions. Excommunicate is to expel someone from the Roman Catholic Church, and this denies them the right to go to heaven. Now, the Pope had the power to excommunicate people or countries from the church, and this was a big deal because if you were excommunicated, it meant when you died, you were no longer able to get into heaven. The Marian exiles. This is when Protestants fled to cities such as Geneva or Frankfurt when Mary I became queen in 1553. Mary I, she was a Catholic queen. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary for a very good reason. She really enjoyed persecuting Protestants and famously burnt 300 Protestants over a fire. And lastly, the vestments controversy. Vestments are the official clothes worn by clergy, and clergy is anyone who works within the church. So we're going to be mentioning clergy as priests, as bishops, as archbishops. Set a little bit of context for the situation for Elizabeth. Have a chance to pause the video, have a quick look at the blanks, and we have some keywords at the bottom to use to fill those in, and see if you can complete any of these statements. When you're done, when you've had a go, just make sure you hit play and we'll take them up together. Great, so we've had a chance to look at filling in some of these blanks, so let's start off. Elizabeth was a Protestant. In 1559, England was mostly Catholic. However, Parliament was mainly Protestant. Elizabeth knew that to maintain support, she needed to keep everybody happy. Mary, Queen of Scots, was claiming that she had the right to the English throne, and many Catholics supported her in this. To do this, Elizabeth wanted to create a national church so that all people could accept or at least tolerate it. And this was a big point for Elizabeth. She didn't need everybody to think the new church was amazing. She just needed them to get on with it. So the religious settlement, and it says settlement in quotations because a settlement would dictate that people are generally happy with it. They have settled. But this was designed to be a Protestant compromise. Even though Elizabeth was saying, I'm going to try to keep everybody happy, she had to make sure that England was going to be more Protestant than Catholic. If she didn't, she was being a bad Protestant herself. So her plan was to create a new Protestant church that would have some elements of the Catholic Church. And this is keeping things like the decorations, the candles, the cross, some of the gold, things that Elizabeth said aren't that important to me as a Protestant, but would really help keep the Catholics happy. But she had to be careful. If she was too harsh on the English Catholics, this could start war with France or Spain. These were two very dominant Catholic countries in Europe at the time. Now, the Pope, he could also excommunicate her. And if England was excommunicated from the church, this might force people to rebel against Elizabeth because they would say, I've worked my whole life to try to get into heaven, and now you're going to mess it up for me. I'm going to have something to say about that and get you off the throne, and we'll put Mary, Queen of Scots, in charge. There would be two acts that would explain the rules, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, and we will go into depth of both of these acts momentarily. So how's Elizabeth going to create her religious settlement? So again, her main concern was isolating England from the rest of Europe. She was really worried about causing conflict within England. She knew that the religious roller coaster we've looked at in the past between Henry, Edward, Mary, and herself, all the religious change really aggravated people. And she knew that most people in England were Catholic and they wouldn't approve of her ruling the nation. She also knew that Mary, Queen of Scots, was a prime candidate to fill in if Elizabeth were to be removed from the throne or executed. So Elizabeth was in a really difficult spot. So she was a Protestant, along with much of her own government. Now that means that her government will only be happy with a Protestant church. Most of England was Catholic, and this means that they're only going to be happy with a Catholic church. And Puritans were very influential people. Puritans were often landowners, very influential in their towns and villages, and they disagreed with both the Catholics and the Protestants. So they're only going to be happy with a Puritan church. So how is Elizabeth going to keep everyone happy? How will she make a new church that will keep all the Protestants happy, something the Catholics will be okay with, and something the Puritans will also attend? And we can start to see now how this is going to be a really difficult situation. And if you can try to think of an example from your own lives where you've tried to keep multiple people happy at the same time, we know how difficult this can be. So enforcing her religious settlement, after she made the rules, uh, generally people got on with it, but there were always going to be some elements of the population who wanted to rebel. So she made the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity. Now, the Act of Supremacy said that Elizabeth was fully in charge of the church, and the Act of Uniformity said how the church will function, what the rules are going to be. And we'll get into detail about this in just one moment. The royal injunctions of 1559 were the instructions given to the clergy, and the clergy are anyone who works in the church, on how the new church is going to be regulated, what the rules are going to be. And it also outlined and defined the consequences of recusancy. Now, being a recusant is someone who does not go to church when they're supposed to. And Elizabeth had very strict rules that every Sunday you must attend church. Now, they set out some fines, but these weren't strictly enforced, so people kind of played fast and loose with these rules. The Act of Exchange of 1559 gave Elizabeth the ability to take land, buildings, and wealth from the church and use it for herself. It also allowed her the ability to force bishops to rent out their land to her as the queen for her to make money from. So this might be, for example, farmland. The 39 Articles of 1563, these were 39 rules that laid down the beliefs of the new Church of England. And Elizabeth didn't actually approve all these rules until 1571. And that just shows not only the thoughts and the time Elizabeth spent in trying to make sure the new church was going to work perfectly, but also her apprehension to make any kind of hard and fast rules that people could potentially disagree with. And the last thing she did was quite clever. So she had her own version of a religious Ofsted, if we want to call it that. She had 125 commissioners who traveled all around the country, and they would go and visit every single little church in every little village. And when they would go into the church, they would check things like, is there an English version of the Bible? Are the priests wearing the correct vestments? Are all the rules being followed? Is there a cross on the wall? And any churches that weren't conforming to the new rules, they would be written up with a warning or a fine. Now, in all of this, there were a number of priests who actually lost their jobs or resigned, and it's about 400 of them ended up being fired because they weren't following her rules correctly. So as promised, the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity. These are two really important acts because they lay out all the rules for how the new church is going to operate. So the best way that we could remember these are looking at the words supremacy and uniformity. And the root word of supremacy is, of course, supreme, and the root word of uniformity is, of course, uniform. So we'll use those definitions to help us remember. The Act of Supremacy said Elizabeth was going to be known as the supreme governor of the church. Now, Henry VIII called himself supreme head of the church, and that made the Pope really angry. The Pope said, "Only I am the supreme head of the church. You can't take that job or that title away from me." And this stated that no one in England had more authority over religion than Elizabeth. So we'll remember Elizabeth is fully in charge by the word supreme. Supreme means you're in charge, you're the best. So Elizabeth is the best. She's in charge of religion. Now, the Act of Uniformity, this set out all the rules and the expectations of the new church. It explained who had to go to church. If you missed a service, you would be known as a recusant and you would have to pay 12p. I know that doesn't sound like a lot of money to us, but in the Elizabethan era, that was a fair chunk of change. It'd be more than a week's wage for most people. It was affordable to pay, but it was a lot of money that you would rather spend elsewhere. The Act of Uniformity also said how priests and bishops should act, and it detailed the forms of church services. So, such as when the name of Jesus was said, people would bow or they would kneel when they would pray. Now, the rules needed to be extremely clear to avoid any kind of confusion, and we'll use the word uniform to mean all the same. So, everyone has to follow all the same rules. So lastly, let's look at the reactions to the settlement, how people reacted both in England and abroad. Now, within a few years, most people really didn't care. They just accepted the new church for what it was. A man named John Fox, he wrote this book. It was called the Acts and Monuments, and it was called the Book of Martyrs. This was all about how evil Mary the First was. And this was kind of reminding people that Elizabeth isn't all that bad by comparison. Now, the cover page of the book showed Protestants being burnt to death. And this was just a reminder to people in England. Yes, Elizabeth has changed the new church, but she's not killing people over it. About 250 priests resigned in protest for the new religious changes, but that's only 3% of priests. 97% of priests accepted the new church. France, they didn't get involved. They were on the verge of a civil war. They didn't want to spend any kind of time or money investing in England. Spain and the Pope, they sort of took a step back and thought, you know what, in a year or two, Elizabeth is going to give up on this new church of hers, it's not going to work, and they'll revert to being a Catholic country yet again. However, there were some small groups who did protest. Catholics strongly opposed new changes, and this was small groups of Catholics. Called for Elizabeth to be excommunicated. Some Catholics a little bit later, towards the 1570s and 1580s, they're going to try to kill Elizabeth because they believe so strongly that England should be Catholic yet again. And the Pope himself, a religious man, he would actually get involved in plots to try to kill Elizabeth as well. So, was the religious settlement a success? Well, this depends on what your definition of success actually is. So, using our own knowledge, we need to ask ourselves, what are the other possible outcomes? We know that the religious settlement, it laid out the new rules for the new church, and generally, people got on with it and followed it. Yes, some small groups of Catholics did try to kill Elizabeth, but for the most part, the population was on board. Well, we know that there could have been rebellion. So people could have tried to overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. And that was attempted, but it did not succeed. There could have been a civil war where the country was divided in two, Catholics versus Protestants. And luckily that was avoided. And lastly, there could have been an assassination where Elizabeth is killed for her religious views. Now, again, this was attempted, but it did not succeed. So we have to ask ourselves, the religious settlement, was it a success? It was designed to try to make a new church in England where everyone would be happy. And as we can see, most people did accept it. So your definition of success might be different from someone else's, but we just need to look at all the facts when we're answering that type of question. What was the intended outcome of the religious settlement, and what actually ended up happening? So that's it for today, all about the religious settlement. Please make sure you complete your quiz on Show My Homework and any other tasks set by your teacher.